Welcome to the Razors Inc. podcast with your host, Jonathan Farini. It's been said that the United States is less a melting pot and more of a salad, with each ingredient's uniqueness shining on its own. However, with art and music, the lines often become more blurred, with many cultural influences blending together to form something bigger and better than its individual parts. So pour yourself a drink, pull up a chair, and hear Jonathan's take on movies, television, and today, an overlooked figure in the American playlist who deserves a second listen. Here's your host, Jonathan Farini.
I want to talk about Trini Lopez, singer-songwriter, because he was integral to advancing this sound, this musical stew, so to speak, that blended easy listening music along with folk music, but more importantly, the central ingredient to this music was something that was overlooked, and that was called the Mexican-American musical sound. And this sound originated in places with large populations of Mexican Americans like East Los Angeles, Dallas, and other places. And Trini Lopez is just somebody you have to know, because what he did laid the groundwork for a lot of good things, not only for the American playlist, but I think for Mexican American Chicano rights, really gifting the listening public with a sound that we sorely needed and deserved to be appreciated. So let me set the stage of the late 1950s and 1960s. I was alive. I was a kid, but I was alive. So I have a basis of understanding this. So what was the musical scene like in the late 1950s and early 1960s? First of all, let me get this out of the way. There was no British invasion yet. That wasn't until about 62 or 63. All those British guys were at home in England listening to American R&B music, figuring out their own acts. So forget about the British invasion. What did we have? What were people listening to? Okay, there was several categories of music. One, there was rock and roll. You had the doo-wop music, those beautiful street corner harmonies. You had Elvis. You had Buddy Holly and the Crickets. You had the Big Bopper. And you had this kid named Richie Valens. He was from Pacoima, California, Mexican-American kid. And he was out on the road singing La Bamba. La Bamba, this was fresh, man. Nobody heard this sound before. And you know something? He hit a nerve. It was popular. And it was such a shame, such a loss that he was killed in a plane crash in '59, because that sound ended. But he found a market. And had he lived, I just believed the advancement of this sound, this Mexican-American music sound. It's been referred to as Chicano rock. I'm not going to dive into that, but research it on your own. It's another term, and there are a lot of wonderful musical acts associated with it. I'm still in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So it's important to discuss the culture that existed in the late 50s, early 60s when Trini Lopez was playing clubs and introducing this rich, beautiful sound. At that time, we didn't celebrate Cinco de Mayo, we didn't celebrate Day of the Dead. To go experience Mexican-American culture, we'd have to go to East Los Angeles. Occasionally, we'd see some lowriders cruising around. In my school, which is a public school at the time, I did not have any Mexican-American students. On television, a potato chip company had a comic character selling corn chips called the Frito Bandito. Also, there was a comic, a guy named Bill Dana, who had this character he invented named Jose Jimenez. And Jose Jimenez would show up on the Ed Sullivan Show and other variety shows. And if you recall the movie The Right Stuff, I think it was the Mercury astronauts would talk about Jose Jimenez. To Bill Dana's credit, Bill Dana retired that character, Jose Jimenez, voluntarily in 1970. The people that were going to work, the people that were punching the clock in the early 60s were old enough and may have participated in a historical event in LA called the Zoot Suit Riots. And this is not a history podcast, but basically that was a confrontation between servicemen, and I think it was called the Pachuco style, but it was basically young Mexican-American men that were not in the service. They were too young to be in the service, or maybe whatever the reasons were, but they were resented, their style of dress and whatnot, by these servicemen, and there were actually confrontations in Los Angeles. So a lot of the listening public had that Zoot Suit Riots and maybe some preconceived notions about Mexican Americans at a time when this unique, rich sound was being introduced by Trini Lopez. And I might add, there was this cat named Herb Alpert who was dialed into this sound, this beautiful sound that he later introduced along with a group called Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. Lastly, it was really cool back then for people to get in their cars and drive down to Tijuana. There was a racetrack called Caliente Racetrack, and there were some really cool bars. It was fashionable to go down to Tijuana, and it was safe. But if you wanted an infusion of Mexican-American culture, my point is you'd go to Tijuana or you'd go into East Los Angeles. So this is the cultural backdrop under which Trini Lopez is going to introduce his music. And that's why his music and Trini Lopez is so important. He's the right guy at the right time. So Ritchie Valens dies, and this sound is put on hold until this singer-songwriter, guitar player named Trini Lopez starts playing clubs. And his music was guitar-based. It was folk music infused with that Mexican-American sound. Now, this is important because you had the rock and rollers, that was one segment. You had the folk music crowd. The folk music crowd was like the Beat generation. It was like them plus idealistic people listening to wonderful American folk music like Woody Guthrie, those guys. But really it was music like Pete Seeger, later Bob Dylan, a whole host of others that were really laying the groundwork for the civil rights movement and all of that. So there was the folk music. And then there was what I call the adult music, the easy listening music. And these were our parents. They were listening to Frank Sinatra. They were listening to Tony Bennett. They were listening to Perry Como. They were listening to Andy Williams and a whole host of others. So those were the three segments of the music listening population in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So Trini Lopez is playing a guitar in clubs. He actually, interestingly enough, so he got his start in Dallas, and I do know he actually played Jack Ruby's club. If you don't know who Jack Ruby is, you can Google him. It's not important to the podcast, but it's just trivia that's interesting. And he's playing this folk music, but with a Mexican-American flavor to it. he's doing that. He signs a couple deals. He's in a couple groups, but he breaks off on his own, and he ends up in a club called PJ's. And he is discovered by none other than Frank Sinatra. Now, Frank Sinatra in the early 1960s was riding high. This was the Rat Pack days. Frank Sinatra had his own record labels called Reprise. And with Nelson Riddle, he was doing some of his finest work. It just stands the test of time. And people that enjoy Sinatra know exactly of what I speak. And Sinatra, because Sinatra came up through the big band era, and, he was exposed to a lot of wonderful Caribbean, Latin music. He had an eye for what Trini Lopez was putting out there. I know that's exactly what happened. And Frank Sinatra signed Trini Lopez to Reprise Records. You can't have a better break into the music business than that. So Frank Sinatra was a big supporter of his. And Trini Lopez goes on to write, produce, and sing. I believe he had 16 songs in the top 40 between 63 and 68. Not only that, he starred in a major motion picture, The Dirty Dozen. This is with Cassavetes. This is with Lee Marvin. That's huge. And there he is. And he also had a variety show, I think it was in 68, by NBC. Trini Lopez, a Mexican-American guy. Trini Lopez was selling a Coca-Cola product called Fresca in 67 or 68. And Trini Lopez was selling records. And he was selling records that sounded like folk music.
Said to me, come here and take a lesson from the lovely lemon tree.
The one was called the Bramble Bush, the other was called the Lemon Tree, and there's a whole host of others. And he covered some great songs. So what Trini Lopez did, I believe, is he took some of that folk music crowd, he infused it with this Mexican-American sound, and he appealed to the folk music group. He definitely broke through and appealed to the adult, the easy listening group. And because of his writing, his lyrics, if you listen to Lemon Tree, Bramble Bush, and his other tunes, they're very catchy. They're very wonderful songs. I also believe he picked up a lot of the rock and roll musical listening crowd. What's the bigger point here? Bigger point is that when Ritchie Valens died, this Mexican-American music, this phenomenon, ended. Ritchie Valens, I believe, broke the glass. Trini Lopez walked through the shards of glass and just brought it home. He brought it to the American playlist. Interestingly enough, he also designed a couple of guitars for Gibson guitar. So we owe Trini Lopez a big debt of gratitude because he was the right guy at the right time. I will contend, I think this music had a lot to do with Jose Feliciano, who was Puerto Rican, his breakthrough. He won a Grammy in 1968. That's huge, folks.
You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I was to say to you, hey, girl, we couldn't get much higher.
Listen to his original music, but also listen to his Feliz Navidad, listen to that, but also Light My Fire by the Doors. And I believe he's still out there performing, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to add one more thing that's very nuanced, and this is my supposition. I believe Trini Lopez, walking through the shards of glass, Trini Lopez bringing this sound to the American public. Trini Lopez being in the movies, Trini Lopez on a commercial. I believe this laid the groundwork for a lot of positive reception for Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. It was just like hand in glove, and it all came together. Trini Lopez lived most of his life out in Palm Springs, California. Interestingly, people don't realize, but Palm Springs was really where Frank Sinatra spent most of his time, not in Beverly Hills or Hollywood, but he could go out there and just relax and be a regular guy. People would leave him alone, but Trini Lopez went out there as well. You know, you have the Rat Pack, right? I really refer to Trini Lopez and Angie Dickinson as being honorary members of the Rat Pack. That was the relationship between Trini Lopez and Frank Sinatra. And another note on Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra saw talent. Believe me, Frank Sinatra, his star was riding high in the early 60s and right through the 60s, but he came up as a crooner, you know, in the 1940s. And by the 1950s, his career had really bottomed out. And it wasn't until the Oscar win From Here to Eternity that his star rose again. So I believe Frank Sinatra, although he achieved success very early on, he never forgot that failure, that period of time where he was wallowing. And I believe he developed a sense of appreciation for the underdog. Make no mistake, Frank Sinatra and Reprise Records signed Trini Lopez because they wanted to sell records and make money. But I believe there was something in there in Frank Sinatra wanting to help what he perceived was an underdog, an unrepresented person that could advance this Mexican-American music sound. Just like he went to bat for Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. could not walk in the front of Vegas casino hotels. Seriously. And Frank Sinatra said, hey, that's not going to happen. And had a role, like many of the African-American workers in the hotels and casinos up there, they all had a role in reversing that discrimination that occurred. So hats off to Frank Sinatra for that.
Bésame, bésame mucho, como si fuera esta noche la última vez.
So back to the major point that I really wanted to bring home was Trini Lopez was a trailblazer. Trini Lopez brought this music to the American playlist. Trini Lopez, we owe him a debt of gratitude. He really picked up the mantle from Ritchie Valens, dusted it off, infused it with his own sound, and moved it forward. So please check out Trini Lopez. Check out his music. Listen to it. Appreciate it. In the 1960s, there were some other Mexican-American acts of lesser-known fame that you might want to check out. So I'm a kid in the 1960s, and AM radio was what was playing on all the car radios. So when I was in my brother's hot rod, I'd have the station on KHJ or KRLA coming out of Los Angeles. And there was a group called Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs.
Uno, dos, 1, 2, 3, 4.
These guys would play country fairs. They'd go anywhere they would have a stage, and they had this sound. It was different. Go listen to it, and you'll know what I'm speaking about. But they would dress up in turbans and like pharaohs, and I really feel sorry for them that they had to do that. But the music that they were making had that Mexican-American sound to it. And those guys never made it as big, but they were part of this stew that was cooking on the stove that we were all going to enjoy. So listen to this music. It's an important part of the American playlist, and we owe a debt of gratitude to all these folks. And I wanted to lay down this podcast about Trini Lopez because you don't hear a lot about him. He deserves to be heard. He passed in 2020, from COVID. out in Palm Springs. So rest in peace, Trini Lopez. Until I see you next time, leave behind a soft footprint, and class is dismissed.
You've been listening to the Razors Inc. podcast with Jonathan Farini. Be sure to check out Jonathan's collection of fiction at the Jonathan B. Farini Story Collection at jonathanfarini.com. There you'll find everything from drama to romance, something for every reader. That's jonathanfarini.com, Farini with 2 R's, 1 N. Or drop an email to razorsincpodcast@gmail.com.